38. My Amish husband kept a list of every time I disobeyed. I found my mother's name on it. The morning I found the ledger, I was looking for a spool of white thread. That is the part that stays with me even now, more than 20 years later. Not the ledger itself, not the words inside it, not even my mother's name written in my husband's careful hand. What I cannot stop thinking about is how ordinary the moment was. I was 31 years old, standing in the cedar closet off the back hallway, reaching past a stack of folded wool blankets, and my fingers found the edge of something hard and narrow tucked behind the bottom shelf. A small book, dark green cloth cover, no title on the spine. I almost set it aside without opening it. I did not set it aside. I want to tell you the whole story, because the ledger was not the beginning. It was not even the worst part. The worst part was what I understood about my mother the moment I saw her name on that page, and what I had to decide to do with that understanding before the week was out. My name is Sarah. I grew up in a district in eastern Ohio, the second of 5 children, in a house where silence was considered a form of faithfulness. We did not talk about difficulty. We did not name what hurt us. We folded it into the routine of the day the same way we folded laundry, carefully, so the creases did not show. My mother, Ruth, was the most capable woman I have ever known. She could put up 40 quarts of tomatoes in a single afternoon, deliver a neighbor's baby before the midwife arrived, and recite entire passages of scripture from memory, while her hands were occupied with something else entirely. She was respected in our community, in the way that very few women were. Not warmly exactly, but with a kind of solemn acknowledgement. Men nodded when she spoke. Other women watched how she carried herself and tried to imitate it. I spent my entire childhood trying to become her. My father, Daniel, was a quiet man, not cruel, not cold, but contained in a way that left very little room for the rest of us to expand. He provided for the family. He attended every church service. He never raised his voice. In our district, that combination was understood as goodness, and I believed it was goodness too, for a very long time. I first met my husband, Eli Graber, when I was 22 years old. He was introduced to me after a Sunday service by his father and mine, standing together near the fence line, as though they had arranged the weather. Eli was 30, broad-shouldered, methodical in his speech. He asked me 2 questions that first afternoon. He asked whether I was skilled at preserving, and whether I had ever given the bishop cause for concern. I answered yes to the first, and no to the second. He nodded both times with the same expression, as though he were checking entries in a column. We were married 11 months later. I want to be honest about those early months, because I think the honest version is more useful than a simpler one. Eli was not a man who shouted or threatened. He did not strike me, or use language that would have alarmed anyone who overheard it. What he was precise. He had a way of arranging the world around him into categories of correct and incorrect, and he applied that same precision to our household, to our schedule, and to me. The first rule I learned was about the evening meal. Supper was to be on the table when he came in from the barn, not warming on the stove, not nearly ready, but on the table. The first time I was 6 minutes late because a jar had slipped and broken, and I had stopped to clean the floor before glass reached the baby. Eli sat down, looked at the empty table, looked at me, and said only, "Note that." I did not know what that meant. I assumed it was directed at himself, a private reminder of some kind. I went back to the kitchen and finished the meal, and told myself it had been nothing. It was not nothing. Over the following weeks I began to notice a pattern that I could not quite name. When I spoke to a neighbor woman longer than Eli thought necessary, he would say it quietly on the walk home. Note that. When I asked the deacon's wife a question about a passage in the Bible, rather than waiting to ask Eli, he said it again that evening while I was washing dishes. Note that. The phrase had no heat in it. That was what made it so difficult to protest. How do you argue against a man who simply observes? I told my mother about it in the late spring of our first year. We were shelling peas together on her back porch, and I described the phrase, the timing of it, the way it followed specific behaviors of mine. My mother's hands did not stop moving. She listened without interruption, and when I finished, she said, "Every husband keeps track of his household. That is his responsibility before God." I accepted that. She was my mother. She had been married to my father for 31 years. If she said it was normal, I believed it was normal. What I did not know then, what I would not understand until I found the ledger, was that my mother had been told almost exactly the same thing by her own mother, years before I was born. My relationship with Eli's mother, Miriam Graber, deserves its own accounting, because I spent the first 2 years of my marriage believing she was my ally. Miriam was a small, sharp-featured woman who smiled often and meant very little of it. She came to our house on Wednesday afternoons, ostensibly to help me learn Eli's household preferences. And she was kind to me in the way that a teacher is kind to a student who has not yet been tested. She praised my bread. She approved of my darning. She told me, on more than one occasion, that Eli had chosen wisely, and she said it with the particular emphasis that suggested she had been part of the choosing. I was grateful to her. That is the word I would have used at the time. Grateful. She was the one who told me, in the fall of my second year, that Eli kept a household record. She mentioned it the way you might mention a bookkeeping practice. Matter-of-factly, without apology. He notes things that require attention, she said, spreading a dish towel across the drying rack. His father did the same. It keeps a household orderly. She did not look at me when she said it. She folded the corner of the towel and left before I could ask a question. That night I tried to ask Eli about it directly. I waited until the children were asleep and said, as calmly as I could manage, that his mother had mentioned he kept a record of the household. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "A man who cannot account for his house cannot account for himself before God." Then he opened his Bible, and the conversation was finished. I lay awake that night telling myself it was a log of expenses, or farm decisions, or scripture notes. I told myself it was nothing that concerned me. I told myself a dozen reasonable things in the dark, and I believed most of them, because the alternative was to believe something I did not yet have the strength to hold. Over the next 3 years, I developed what I can only describe as a split awareness. On the surface, I was a functioning wife and mother. I raised our 2 boys. I kept the house. I appeared at every church function with my clothing pressed and my disposition pleasant. Beneath that surface, I was constantly calculating. I measured my words before I spoke them. I considered the timing of every request. I chose silence over questions, not because I had nothing to ask, but because I had learned that questions were noted. What I did not realize was that silence was also being noted. There is a woman in our community named Clara, who was 3 years older than me, and had been widowed young. She was one of the few people I allowed myself to speak freely with, mostly because our friendship was conducted in the spaces Eli did not monitor. At quilting circle, between services, during the moments when community life created a natural cover for conversation. Clara was not a rebellious woman, but she was an observant one. And sometime in the 3rd year of my marriage she said something to me that I spent months trying to dismiss. "Sarah," she said, "does Eli ever let you be wrong?" I told her I did not understand the question. "Does he ever let a mistake simply pass?" she said, "without naming it?" I thought about it honestly, standing there with my hands in a basin of soapy water, and I realized the answer was no. I had not made a single error in 4 years that had not been, in some way, acknowledged. Not punished in any way I could point to. Just acknowledged. Permanently. I changed the subject. I did not want the thing Clara was handing me, because accepting it would have required me to act, and I did not yet know what action was possible. It was 6 months after that conversation that I found the ledger. I held it in the cedar closet for what must have been 5 minutes before I opened it. The cover was worn at the corner, where it had rested against the shelf. Inside, the pages were divided into columns in Eli's handwriting. A date on the left, a description in the center, and a single initial on the right. The initial was always the same, S. My initial. The entries were specific and steady, and went back to the first week of our marriage. Spoke with neighbor woman after service without permission. S. Questioned elder's wife regarding scripture. S. Failed to have supper prepared at appointed hour. S. Spoke to Clara Mast without informing husband of topic. S. I turned the pages slowly. There were hundreds of entries. Years of them. Things I barely remembered. Things I had long since convinced myself had not mattered. They were all here, assembled with the same quiet precision I had watched Eli apply to every other aspect of his life. I was in his ledger, the same way the farm expenses were in his ledger. Categorized, dated, accounted for. And then I turned to the back section. The final 20 or so pages were older. The paper had a different texture, slightly yellowed, and the handwriting was not Eli's. It was his father's. I recognized it from the property documents I had seen once when we transferred the deed on the orchard. The same divided columns, the same format, a date, a description, an initial. The initial was R. My mother's name is Ruth. Her initial is R. He had inherited it, and my mother, my capable, respected, composed mother, the woman who had stood on her porch and told me that every husband kept track of his household, had been in this same ledger, or one exactly like it, kept by Eli's father, Jonas Graber. My mother had been married to my father. I knew that. What I had never known, what no one had ever told me, was that before my father, before her life as I understood it, Ruth had been briefly spoken for by Jonas Graber. The arrangement had broken apart before it became a marriage. I had heard the vaguest outline of a broken courtship once, in passing, from an aunt who immediately stopped speaking when my mother entered the room. I had never asked about it. In our household, you did not ask. What the ledger told me, what those R-initialed pages told me with their careful dates and their careful descriptions of small resistances and unapproved conversations and questions asked in the wrong company, was that my mother had not simply been courted by Jonas Graber. She had been monitored by him, she had been in his ledger, and she had gotten out, but she had never told me. I closed the book and put it back behind the blankets, and went to the kitchen, and stood at the window for a very long time, watching the light move across the field. I want to tell you that I confronted Eli that same evening. I did not. I waited 4 days, which I am not entirely proud of, but I want you to understand what those 4 days looked like. I was not simply afraid. I was recalculating everything I thought I knew about the people who had formed my life. My mother knew what this household was. She had seen inside it, or one shaped exactly like it. She had chosen not to warn me, whether that was weakness or protection, or something I still do not have a clean word for. I could not decide. On the 3rd day, I drove to my mother's house. She was alone. My father was in the far field. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, and I asked her, as directly as I knew how, whether she had known Jonas Graber kept a household record before she ended the courtship. The color left her face in a way I had never seen before. My mother, who did not flinch at anything, went completely still. After a long moment she said, "Where did you find that?" Not, "I don't know what you're talking about." Not, "That was a long time ago." She went straight to the question of how I had found it, which told me everything I needed to know about what she had been carrying. I told her. She listened, and then she told me what she had never told anyone in 30 years of keeping it. She had ended the courtship with Jonas Graber in the winter of her 20th year, after finding an early version of that same ledger in his family's home. She had been shaken badly enough to break the arrangement, which had caused significant community damage to her family's reputation. So she had eventually married my father, who was not a man who kept ledgers, and she had truly believed, that what Jonas Graber had done was particular to him, that it did not run in families, that his son, raised partly away from Jonas and his uncle's household, would not have learned it. She had been wrong. "I should have told you," she said. She did not cry. My mother did not cry. But her hands on the table were trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat to stop it. "When you were being introduced to Eli, I told myself it was a different generation. I told myself Jonas had been the problem, not the practice." I asked her why she had not told me when I came to her in the first year, when I had described the phrase, "note that," and she had told me it was a husband's responsibility before God. She was quiet for a very long time. "Because I had already given my permission for the match," she said finally. "Because I did not know how to tell you what I should have refused to forget. I drove home in the early evening with the fields going gold on either side of the road, and I understood something that I have not found a better way to say since. My mother had not betrayed me out of cruelty. She had betrayed me out of the same thing the ledger was built on: the belief that silence is a form of protection, that not naming something keeps it from being real, that if you hold very still and say very little, the damage will somehow be contained. She had been taught that. I had been taught that. Eli had been taught to record it. I went home, and I took the ledger from behind the blankets in the cedar closet, and I put it on the kitchen table, where Eli would see it when he came in from the barn. And I sat down in the chair across from the door, and I waited. What followed that evening was the most honest conversation Eli and I had ever had, and I say that with the full knowledge of how little it resembled the conversations I had imagined for most of my marriage. There was no shouting. There were no tears on his part. He sat down across from the ledger, looked at it, looked at me, and said, "You went through my belongings." I told him that I had. I told him I had seen every page. I told him I had seen his father's section. "My father was a careful man," he said. "His ledger has my mother's initial in it," I said. That was the only moment his expression shifted. A small flicker of something I could not fully read. Then it settled back into its usual arrangement. "A household needs order," he said. "A ledger is not a household," I said. "It is a record of evidence. It is a case being built against someone." He did not answer that. He reached across the table and picked up the ledger and held it, and I told him then, clearly and without raising my voice, that I was not going to pretend I had not seen it. I told him I was going to speak to the bishop, not to end our marriage in that moment. I had 2 sons and a life in that community, and I was not prepared for that to be the single conversation that changed everything. But because what was in those pages was not a household record, it was a document built to make me feel that every choice I made was permanently wrong. Eli said, "The bishop will tell you the same thing my mother told you." I said, "Then I would like to hear him say it." I did speak to the bishop, and Eli was right in one respect. The bishop was not prepared to call the ledger harmful. He called it unusual. He suggested that Eli and I pray together regarding household expectations. He was careful and measured, and he suggested nothing that would disturb the surface of anything. But something had shifted beneath the surface, that no bishop's measured suggestion could put back the way it had been. I had named it. I had sat at a kitchen table and put words directly onto what had been done to me, and I had watched Eli Graber fail to find an answer for those words. That matters more than I can adequately explain to someone who has not lived in a household where naming a thing was treated as a form of disobedience. I did not leave that year. I want to be honest about that too. I stayed for another 2 years, and they were not easy years, and they were not years in which everything was repaired. Because some things cannot be repaired, they can only be acknowledged and worked around. I spoke to my mother more honestly in those 2 years than I had in all the years before them combined. She was not able to give me back what had been lost, but she stopped pretending the loss wasn't there, and that was something. What eventually ended my marriage was quieter than the ledger. It was the morning I found Eli teaching our older son, who was 8 years old, how to keep a record of his younger brother's behavior. A small notebook, 2 columns, date and infraction. I stood in the doorway of that room, and I understood that I had already made my decision. I had made it 2 years earlier at that kitchen table. I had simply been waiting to find out if I was wrong. I was not wrong. My sons are grown men now. One of them has asked me, more than once, why I waited as long as I did. I tell him the same thing every time, because it is the truest answer I have. I stayed until I was certain I was not destroying something real, and I left when I understood that what I had been protecting was not my marriage, but the idea of a marriage. Those are different things. It took me time to learn the difference, and I do not apologize for the time it took. My mother and I talked about Jonas Graber's ledger one more time, near the end of her life, when she was ill and the days had a quality of last things. I asked her if she had ever wondered what had happened to the women Jonas recorded after her. She said, "I thought about it every day of my adult life." I held her hand, and I did not tell her that her wondering had not been enough. She already knew. The knowing was part of what had made her ill, in ways a doctor could not locate on a chart. The last thing she said to me on that subject, 3 days before she died, was this: "Tell your boys' wives. Tell them before the ink dries." I think about that sentence often. Tell them before the ink dries. In the community where I grew up, silence was handed down the way property was handed down. In legal instruments, witnessed by the right people, with everyone's name on the correct line. I spent 31 years believing that my mother's composure was strength. I understand now that it was survival, and that survival and strength are not always the same thing. She survived her ledger. I survived mine. What I hope for my sons, and for anyone carrying a version of this story, without a name for it yet, is something different from survival. The green cloth ledger is gone. I burned it in the yard the week after I moved out, on a cold afternoon in late November, with my younger son sitting on the porch steps watching me. He did not ask what I was burning. He was 6 years old, and I think somehow he already knew. I watched the pages go. Every entry, every date, every small recorded resistance. My name, and my mother's name, which had been there all along, waiting in the back pages for someone to finally look.